Let's start with what could be a busy week for the federal government as Cabinet starts its three-day retreat in Montreal today. Immigration and its connection to the housing crisis is front and center for the feds following comments Immigration Minister Mark Miller made on this program exactly a week ago that he's considering capping international students to deal with the issue. Why international students? We'll take a look at this. Back in 2015, when the Liberals came into power, there were just over 350,000 international students coming into Canada a year. But in 2023, that number was on track to reach 900,000. It's a huge part of a massive population boom in this country in the last year. Nearly 313,000 non-permanent residents, for example, came to Canada in the third quarter alone, the biggest quarterly jump in more than 5 decades. But that isn't the only pressure point on the immigration file for Ottawa. This week, Quebec's Premier, François Legault, fired off a letter to the Prime Minister telling him the province is nearing a, quote, breaking point in being able to deal with the influx of asylum seekers. Legault wants money, and a lot of it, nearly $500 million to start to cover the associated costs. Here to talk about all of that is the minister who oversees Ottawa's relationship with the provinces, Dominic LeBlanc. Hi, Minister. Good to have you back on the show. Thanks for making the time.
Hi, Vashi. It's nice to be on the show.
You responded to Premier Legault's letter on social media, Minister, saying that your government takes his concerns seriously. But I also saw that you listed off money that you've already sent to the province. Does that mean you are or you are not prepared to compensate Quebec the full $470 million they're asking for?
So I wanted to remind Quebecers that the Government of Canada has been very generous in supporting Quebec, that has done a great deal to welcome asylum seekers. We think that Quebec has been a valuable partner, and we have since 2017 increased the transfers to Quebec to recognize the cost pressures. And the Department of Finance and my colleague Chrystia Freeland is discussing with her Quebec counterparts the best way to arrive at an agreement. But I pointed out also, I think that Quebec benefits from an immigration arrangement that goes back to Mr. Mulroney and Robert Bourassa, who was Premier of Quebec in the 90s. You probably weren't born yet, Vashi, when that agreement was signed. And the Government of Canada transferred last year $750 million to help Quebec with immigration, francisation, settlement. So no other province has that arrangement. We'll continue to be generous with the Government of Quebec because they are doing a heavy lift in terms of welcoming and assisting asylum seekers that arrive in Quebec.
And for the record, I was alive then for at least 10 years. But I do understand the unique situation Quebec's in. At the same time, it's a very similar ask in the same area than the one we're hearing from Toronto, right? In particular, that the mayor of that city says unless the federal government provides $250 million to cover the costs associated with asylum seekers in shelters, that she is going to further increase the property tax rate, by 6%. In Toronto. Are you having those same discussions with the Finance Department about providing that money to Toronto?
So again, I know that the Finance Minister, who's from Toronto, has had conversations with the city and the province. I'm looking forward to talking myself with Mayor Chow next week. Toronto has, as it has for decades, been a source of enormous support to welcome newcomers. And like Quebec, Ontario and Toronto have had a considerable number of asylum seekers in recent years. And we have been and will continue to work with Ontario and Toronto.
In the case of Toronto, I spoke with one of your caucus colleagues on my other program this week, Yvonne Baker, and I'm just wondering how to reconcile what you're saying here, which seems very open to the possibility of providing that $250 million, if I interpret that correctly. You haven't closed the door on it, with what he said, which is essentially, he used the word shakedown to describe what he thought could be happening in Toronto. Is it the position of your government that Toronto is lying about how much money is necessary?
So I'm not, Vashi, an expert in terms of the finances for the city of Toronto. I know that they have a very significant budget. I had conversations with Mayor Chow's predecessor around a number of these issues. But I think it's important that we allow the finance minister, who is from the city of Toronto, and who has had those conversations both with the province and the city, to continue those discussions. We have been very generous to the city of Toronto and to the province of Ontario in some of these areas. But we recognize that there are increased pressures across the country, but Ontario and Quebec carry a large proportion of this burden. So the Government of Canada will ensure that we continue to work with them.
Just to be clear, though, you don't think there's a shakedown happening?
I don't speak for my caucus colleagues, Vashi, who choose to use the words on your program that they do. But as I say, I'm going to speak to Mayor Chow next week as well. But I think that our government has always worked constructively with Toronto and Premier Ford's government, and will continue to do that.
Asylum seekers are part of the equation when it comes to temporary residents coming into this country. Last week on this program, Minister Miller was sitting in your place, the minister who oversees immigration for the federal government, and he said in the first quarter to first half of the year that your government would be looking at capping another part of the equation when it comes to temporary residents, and that's international students. Do you anticipate that you could make an announcement to that effect as soon as this weekend in the at the cabinet retreat?
I don't know what Mark's planning is in terms of an announcement, Vashi, but I do know that he and I have discussed, and he's discussed with cabinet colleagues, the very significant increase in foreign students and the pressure that that puts on things like housing availability, rental housing, and ensuring that there's integrity in terms of those arrivals and those students. I'm not sure the problem is with sort of the traditional university students. I think there are some other smaller colleges that perhaps need to be looked at in a more robust way. He's doing this work, and he'll have something to say in due course. But I hadn't heard it was going to be this weekend, but I know he's working on it.
I do want to ask about the timeline, because the way in which you're talking about it, for example, that this is now, a cause for concern, a pressure point. I wonder if perhaps that assertion could have been made much earlier to greater benefit to Canadians. And I'll tell you why, because the numbers were staggering even in 2022, more than 800,000 international students. In 2023, estimated to be closer to 900,000 international students. I understand there's provincial jurisdiction on making sure housing is there and regulating universities, but your government issues the visas. Why weren't you issuing fewer earlier when you knew there was a housing crisis?
Well, because those conversations, as you noted, Vashi, are held with provinces, and in some cases, Canadian associations of universities and colleges and others, that were very much pushing the government not to dramatically reduce the number of foreign students. So there's a balance there, but that year-over-year increase that you properly noted is something that concerns us.
Is it about, Minister, balance, or is it about the fact that Canadians, if you look at public opinion polling, are losing faith in your government to address the housing crisis, and you now feel it necessary to do so?
So we're at work on the housing, the availability of housing, housing affordability, rental housing affordability. We're doing a lot of work in that space, and we'll continue to do more, Vashi. So that is sort of an urgent and separate track that we have been working on, but we'll be discussing that at the cabinet retreat early next week. We've put $2.7 billion of a $4 billion fund already in a number of agreements to accelerate the availability of housing, but there are a number of other measures. So I know in this case, my colleague Sean Fraser has a whole series of measures that he's looking at and discussing with cabinet colleagues.
Respectfully, the measures and the comments that you're making, the measures you're referring to, are all focused on the supply side. And because your government waited until this fall to make those announcements, it's going to take 10 years to build the housing stock by, let's say, 750,000. 1.2 million new people. The population grew by 1.2 million just last year. It's supply and demand. Why has your government waited as long as it has to even consider looking at the demand side of the equation?
So we've set immigration targets, Vashi, that we think are responsible and appropriate. And there again, business groups across the country are urging us to bring new people to Canada as immigrants to fill labor market needs in big cities and small towns across the country. We're working with provinces in that very space as well. So we think that we can and should welcome to Canada the right number of immigrants, of new Canadians, at the same time recognizing that there are infrastructure pressures, including housing, obviously, that need to be addressed. So we're prepared to do what's necessary in both sides of this equation. It's not a panacea to somehow tighten the tap on immigrants or foreign students and magically the housing pressures will all be resolved. We recognize that that's part of a plan to ensure that we have affordable housing for Canadians, and that's exactly what Mark Miller and Sean Fraser and our government are working on.
My point, Minister, though, was, for example, through reporting from the Canadian press last week, your government was made aware by bureaucrats 2 years ago that the demand side of the equation would have an impact on housing affordability, and you didn't do anything about that at the time. I understand there are other policy pressures, that there are businesses who need immigrants in order to fill very significant labor crunches. But now you're faced with an issue in which many Canadians feel like they can't afford a home. And is it only because that is having a direct political impact on your party that you're now deciding to do something about it?
Well, Vashi, I would disagree a little bit that we have been re-engaged in housing and building housing and financing housing and working with provinces in a way that the government before we won the 2015 election had never done. So we have, since we formed a government, worked with provinces and not-for-profit groups and co-ops and municipalities in the housing area. So we have been active, but you're right, there have been increased pressures and affordability has become a very real and understandable concern. So we need to do more and we'll continue to do more.
Minister, I'll leave it on that note. I appreciate you making the time as always. Thank you.